November 3, 1941. 23 Orchard Court, Bloomsbury, London. Nancy Wake, 33, sat in a nondescript flat above a furniture shop, chain-smoking cigarettes as she stared at the wireless set before her. The radio operator was late. In espionage, lateness meant exposure. Exposure meant death. Outside, the streets of London echoed with the sound of air raid sirens, a familiar symphony of destruction that had become the soundtrack to British survival. But Nancy wasn't thinking about German bombers. She was thinking about the Gestapo, about the men who tortured her in Vienna, about the moment she had sworn to herself that if she survived this war, she would make certain the Nazis paid. The knock came in 3 short bursts. The signal. Nancy opened the door to find a young man no older than 20, pale and trembling. His code name was Archimedes. He carried information that would change the entire trajectory of the war in occupied France. But first, he had to survive the night. What Nancy didn't know, what nobody in British intelligence yet understood, was that she stood at the threshold of a revolution in espionage. In the coming months and years, women would become the most valuable asset the Allies possessed. Not through brute force or military might, but through something far more dangerous: the human capacity for deception, courage, and sacrifice. The Germans had a fatal blind spot. In 1939, when Adolf Hitler consolidated his power and began the systematic militarization of Europe, Nazi ideology had already decided the proper role of women in the Third Reich. They were mothers. They were bearers of Aryan children. They were not, in any circumstance, to be taken seriously as intelligence operatives. This assumption would cost the Nazi regime incalculably. The story of the women spies of World War II is not simply the story of brave individuals. It is the story of how an intelligence service born from desperation became the most sophisticated weapon the Allies wielded against Nazi-occupied Europe. It is the story of how women, excluded from combat roles and underestimated by every military establishment, became the architects of Germany's downfall. It begins with one man's desperate idea. June 22, 1940, Winston Churchill's war room, beneath the streets of London. The map on the wall showed a Britain standing alone. France had fallen. The evacuation at Dunkirk had left the British army stripped of equipment and morale. The Nazi-German war machine, having consumed Poland, Belgium, and the Netherlands in weeks, now stood across the Channel, preparing for invasion. Churchill, his face etched with exhaustion and determination, summoned Hugh Dalton, Minister of Economic Warfare. "What will you do to set Europe ablaze?" Churchill asked. 3 weeks later, the Special Operations Executive was born, SOE, a secret organization tasked with one impossible mission: prevent Nazi domination of Europe through clandestine operations, sabotage, and intelligence gathering. The senior leadership was entirely male. The strategy was conceived by men who had spent their careers in conventional military intelligence. But from the beginning, one problem plagued SOE. They needed spies who could move through occupied Europe without drawing attention. The Germans had thousands of soldiers. They had the Gestapo. They had informants on every street corner. But they had trained their entire security apparatus to watch for one thing: men of military age. They were not watching for women. It was this insight, more than any other factor, that led to one of the most radical decisions of the war: recruit women as operational spies. Not as secretaries, not as administrators, but as field agents responsible for sabotage, intelligence gathering, and organizing resistance networks. The decision scandalized British military leadership. General Colin Gubbins, who would eventually lead SOE, received pushback from every corner of the military establishment. The concerns were predictable. Women lacked the fortitude for espionage. Women would be captured and break under torture. Women had no place in dirty, dangerous work. What the objectors failed to understand was that women had already proven themselves capable of precisely this work. In Poland, in France, in the Netherlands, women had been running underground networks since the Nazi occupation began. They weren't trained by SOE. They hadn't attended special schools or received commendations. They were simply ordinary women who had decided that occupation was unacceptable. And they were invisible. A woman carrying forged documents was less likely to be stopped than a man. A woman working as a courier could explain her presence in a town more plausibly than a military-aged male. A woman could extract information through charm and manipulation where a man might resort to confrontation. And when captured, the Germans would make the gravest mistake. They would underestimate her. The first female agent recruited by SOE was Martha Cohn, a 23-year-old French Jewish woman. Cohn had fled to Switzerland after her family was arrested by the Gestapo. She spoke 4 languages fluently and possessed a photographic memory. She was also willing to die for vengeance. When British intelligence approached her with an offer to become a spy, she accepted immediately. "I wanted to do something," she would later recall, "something that mattered. Every day that passed without action felt like a betrayal of my family." But recruiting was only the first challenge. These women had to be trained, and the training regime created for SOE agents was unlike anything in military education. Special training schools dotted the English countryside from 1941 onward. Stately homes and country estates became clandestine training grounds where women learned the arts of survival, deception, and death. At Eraseg House in the Scottish Highlands, Christine Granville, codename Madeline, arrived in early 1940, before SOE even officially existed. She was 30 years old, a Polish-born adventurer who had already lived a dozen lives. She spoke Polish, French, German, Italian, and English. She had survived the Gestapo by being captured and managing to talk her way out of custody through sheer force of personality and quick thinking. The instructors at Eraseg had never trained anyone like her. She wasn't afraid. One instructor would later write in his assessment, not because she was fearless, but because she had already stared into the abyss and stepped back. Everything else seemed manageable by comparison. The curriculum was relentless. Combat training in the morning, how to kill silently with a knife, how to use a gun under pressure, how to break bones with your bare hands. Explosives training in the afternoon, how to plant a bomb in a railway line, how to destroy a munitions factory without being detected. Radio operator training for those with technical aptitude. Morse code, encryption, the fine art of transmitting without being intercepted by German signal intercepts. But the most important training was psychological. The instructors understood something fundamental. Physical training could be given to anyone, but the ability to maintain a cover story under torture, to resist breaking for hours, days, sometimes weeks, that required something deeper. That required understanding oneself so thoroughly that even under the most extreme stress, the cover persona remained intact. They trained recruits in interrogation resistance. A German intelligence officer would spend hours questioning them, employing psychological tactics, threats, and deprivation. The recruits had to maintain their false identities. They had to lie convincingly about non-existent networks. They had to protect the real agents by offering false information so plausible that the Germans would waste resources investigating dead ends. Nancy Wake arrived at Eraseg in the spring of 1941. She was taller than most women, athletic from a lifetime of outdoor activity, and possessed an almost reckless courage that made the instructors nervous. She was dangerous, one assessment read. Dangerous not because she was trained, but because she was convinced of the rightness of her cause. That kind of conviction makes people capable of acts that cautious men would never attempt. Wake had already seen what the Nazis did to France. She had watched her country conquered in weeks. She had seen Jews rounded up and deported. She had personally helped smuggle people out of Vienna before the Gestapo closed in on her. Now she wanted blood. The selection process for SOE operatives was brutal precisely because failure was fatal. The British didn't just need spies. They needed people who could survive impossible situations, who could think on their feet, who could kill if necessary and then live with themselves afterward. They needed people willing to undergo the psychological transformation from civilian to operative. That meant erasing your old life, your old identity. You would have new documents, a new family history, new memories you had to recall without hesitation. If anyone pulled you aside and asked about your childhood, you had to have a story so thoroughly memorized that it became real. One of the most talented recruits was Violette Sabo. She was only 23 years old when she joined SOE, but she possessed something rare: absolute certainty of purpose. Violette was half French, half British. Her father had been a captain in the British Army during the First World War. Her mother was French. Growing up between two cultures, she had absorbed something fundamental. She belonged to both Britain and France in a way that transcended nationality. When France fell to Nazi occupation, Violette experienced it as a personal loss. She had been trained in secretarial work, but after France fell, she joined the Women's Royal Army Service. A British intelligence officer noticed her during routine recruitment, saw something in her. A combination of linguistic ability, physical prowess, and an almost fierce determination. Violette underwent 6 months of intensive training. She learned to operate a Sten gun with the precision of a trained soldier. She learned to use explosives. She memorized Morse code. She studied the geography of occupied France until she could navigate cities in the dark with her eyes closed. But the most important lesson came when her instructors told her something no one in normal military service would ever say: "You will almost certainly be tortured if captured. You will be tortured by professionals who have refined the technique over years. Your job is not to resist. No one can ultimately resist that kind of pain. Your job is to buy time. Buy time for your networks to disperse, for other agents to flee, for the operation to survive your capture." Violette memorized the number to call if she was ever arrested: the Soviet embassy in Switzerland. Soviet agents, she was told, had networks that could sometimes extract Allied prisoners. Not always, but sometimes. By late 1941, the pipeline of female agents flowing into occupied Europe had become a flood. They had code names: Odette, Lise, Pearl, Danielle, Simone, Christine, Nancy, Violette. They had new faces hidden behind layers of forged documents. They had cover stories so elaborate and carefully constructed that they could withstand weeks of interrogation. And they were being sent into a nightmare. May 15, 1942. Occupied France. South of Lyon. Lise de Bissac stepped off the train at a small station, her suitcase containing radio equipment hidden beneath layers of clothing. She was 38 years old, the oldest of the SOE female agents in France. She spoke French with a slight English accent that she had trained herself to suppress through years of practice. She had a cover identity: Madeleine Levine, a widow living on a small inheritance. No one looking at her would see anything remarkable. A middle-aged woman traveling through occupied France. Unremarkable, invisible, perfect. But in her mind, in the compartments of her consciousness that had been specifically trained by SOE, she was a soldier. A soldier without uniform, without official status, without any protection if captured. A soldier whose mission was to organize the French resistance into an effective fighting force and gather intelligence for the Allied invasion that everyone knew was coming. If captured, she would be shot as a spy. If she was particularly unlucky, she would be tortured first. The Gestapo in occupied France had evolved into something terrifying. The initial military structure of the occupation had been supplemented, then replaced by security apparatus designed for pure control through terror. Torture had become refined into an art form. The Germans had scientific approaches to breaking down human resistance: sensory deprivation, sleep deprivation, psychological manipulation, the application of pain with just enough precision that the victim remained conscious, capable of suffering. Women were not exempt from this treatment. In some cases, the Germans considered women easier to break, an assumption that would repeatedly prove catastrophically wrong. Lise made her way to a safe house in Lyon. The resistance cell she was supposed to organize did not yet exist. That was her job: create a network of reliable operatives from scratch, teach them how to gather intelligence without being detected, establish communication protocols with London, and prepare them for the moment when sabotage would become possible. It was, by any reasonable standard, an impossible task. And yet, by the middle of 1942, Lise had established a network of over 100 resistance operatives. They had collected detailed intelligence on German defenses, troop movements, supply lines. The information flowed back to London through her radio operator, transmitted in cipher so complex that German decryption experts worked for months without success. In London, at Baker Street headquarters, the intelligence provided by Lise and other female agents was changing the entire strategic picture. The Allies had begun to understand not just where German forces were located, but how they were organized, what their supply situations were, how German officers thought. This information was, quite literally, worth armies. And it was being gathered by women working alone in apartments across occupied France, risking their lives every single day. The danger was not abstract. It was constant and immediate. On June 28, 1942, Diana Roden, a 27-year-old British agent working in Rouen, was arrested by German military police. The circumstances remained unclear. Either her radio operator had been caught and forced to disclose her location, or the Germans had pinpointed her radio broadcasts through direction finding. What was certain was that she was now in German custody. The interrogation began immediately. Diana, trained to resist, maintained her cover identity for 48 hours. She revealed nothing that would endanger other agents. When the Gestapo realized they couldn't break her through questioning, they escalated to torture. But Diana had been trained for this. The pain was a physical fact, but it didn't change her fundamental commitment to protecting her network. After 2 days, they moved her to a Gestapo facility outside Paris. The moment Diana crossed that threshold, she entered a different world. A world where torture was not occasional but systematic. A world where the goal was not information extraction. The Gestapo assumed that eventually everyone talked, but rather the demonstration of power, the breaking of the human spirit, the transformation of a person into a thing. Diana Roden would spend the next 2 years in German custody, moved from one facility to another, subjected to interrogations that lasted hours. She would be tortured repeatedly, but she would never break. She would never betray her networks. She would maintain her dignity and her silence through an ordeal that would have destroyed most people. But not everyone was as resilient as Diana. July 10, 1943.
Occupied France.
Paris. Odette Sansom, a 28-year-old French-British agent, was arrested along with her network. The circumstances were complex. There had been a security breach. A German double agent had infiltrated the network. But Odette didn't know this as she was dragged from a safe house in Lyon and thrown into a Gestapo cell. She was interrogated for hours. The Germans wanted to know the full extent of her network, the names of other agents, the location of radio sets. Odette had memorized her legend, her cover story, so thoroughly that it was essentially true. She was supposed to be a liaison officer connected to British intelligence. but she kept the names of other agents locked in a compartment of her mind that the Gestapo could never access. The interrogation turned to torture. Gestapo Major Konrad Pfeiffer, who would later testify at the Nuremberg trials, was present during at least some of these sessions. He described in legal documents what happened to Odette, though the full details were never publicly disclosed. The woman was subjected to progressive levels of pain application. Her fingernails were extracted. Burns were applied to her skin. The interrogators employed psychological techniques, showing her photographs of executed agents, telling her that resistance was futile, that other networks had already been destroyed. Odette did not break. She would later describe the experience with a clarity that belied the trauma. "I was no longer a person. I was an object being worked on. They wanted me to believe that I had no will, no choice. But I did have a choice. I could choose what I said. I could choose what I revealed. And I chose to say nothing of value." The Germans never obtained the information they sought. Frustrated, they moved her to a concentration camp, Ravensbrück, a facility designed specifically for the imprisonment and destruction of women deemed enemies of the Reich. She would spend 17 months in that camp. 17 months of systematic starvation, forced labor, and constant threat of execution. 17 months where every day could be her last. And yet, Odette Sansom survived. Not because she was stronger than the system designed to break her, but because she had made a decision. She would not let them destroy her. She would not let them have the satisfaction of her complete destruction. That decision, that simple, fundamental act of internal resistance, kept her alive when thousands around her died. The story of Odette was not unique. It was repeated across occupied Europe with different names and different details, but the same fundamental narrative. Women arrested, tortured, imprisoned, and yet somehow maintaining their humanity and their silence in the face of systematic dehumanization. Violette Sabo, the 23-year-old agent who had shown such promise in training, was captured on June 30th, 1944, just weeks after D-Day. She had been parachuted back into France to coordinate sabotage operations in preparation for the invasion. Her radio operator had been arrested, and she had attempted to escape on a bicycle. German soldiers fired on her. She returned fire with her Sten gun, killing or wounding several of them before being captured. She was interrogated by the Gestapo for days. They wanted to know about other networks, about the plans for sabotage, about the upcoming invasion. Violette revealed nothing. The Germans, aware that she was British by nationality but had fought like a soldier, treated her with a kind of brutal respect. Eventually, they classified her as too dangerous to keep alive. She was transferred to Ravensbrück concentration camp, where she would die, along with thousands of other women deemed enemies of the Nazi regime. But not before she had impressed her captors with something they had never seen before: the courage of a woman who had chosen to fight back. One German guard, who survived the war, gave testimony about Violette. She was different from other prisoners. She had a kind of fire in her eyes. We would beat her, we would starve her, and she would still stand straight. She would not give us the satisfaction of her complete submission. It was as if she had decided that they could take her life, but they could not take her will. The German High Command was baffled by these women. Intelligence reports flowing from occupied territories described agents who would not break under torture, who maintained their cover stories for months in custody, who seemed almost to welcome death rather than betray their networks. This was not supposed to be possible. The entire apparatus of the Gestapo was built on the assumption that pain and deprivation would eventually produce cooperation. That assumption was being disproven every day by women who had apparently transcended the physical limitations of human suffering. The Nazis began developing a new theory. Perhaps these women were not actually human in the conventional sense. Perhaps they were some kind of engineered super soldier. Perhaps British intelligence had discovered some psychological technique that removed the capacity for pain. They were wrong about all of it. The women spies of SOE were human. They felt pain. They experienced fear. They were terrified of torture and death. But they had undergone a specific psychological training that had essentially reprogrammed their response to trauma. They had been taught that there was something more important than their physical survival. The survival of their networks, the protection of their comrades, the success of the mission that would defeat Nazi Germany. That hierarchy of values, placing the mission above personal survival, was itself a form of courage that the Nazis could not understand. January 1st, 1944.
Occupied France.
Vichy Zone. Nancy Wake, the woman who had sworn vengeance on the Gestapo, had become something legendary among the French resistance. She was 36 years old, commanding one of the largest resistance networks in southern France, over 7,000 operatives. German intelligence had issued a Gestapo order offering 5 million francs for her capture, alive preferably, dead acceptable. She was known as the White Mouse because she had escaped German capture so many times that the Gestapo had begun to suspect she was using supernatural means of escape. The Gestapo didn't understand what Nancy understood. Survival in the underground wasn't about being smarter or stronger than your enemy. It was about understanding how your enemy thought and operating in the spaces where they didn't expect you. Nancy had been living undercover in Lyon for months. She had established a network of safe houses, weapons caches, and communication protocols. She had trained resistance fighters in sabotage and combat. She had gathered intelligence on German movements. She had made herself indispensable to the success of the resistance in southern France. But she had also made herself a target of extraordinary priority for German intelligence. The Gestapo created a special unit to hunt her, staffing it with their most experienced interrogators and tracker officers. They set traps. They infiltrated her networks. But every time they closed in, Nancy seemed to vanish, only to reappear weeks later in a different city with a new cover identity. What the Gestapo didn't know was that Nancy had a secret weapon, a network of women spies working beneath her command, all of whom had undergone the same SOE training that she had. These women were positioned throughout Lyon and the surrounding territories. They served as a living warning system, providing Nancy with intelligence about Gestapo movements hours or even days before arrests were made. It was women protecting women, spies protecting spies, a network of the invisible operating beneath the surveillance apparatus of the Nazi regime. By early 1944, as D-Day preparations accelerated and the Allies prepared for invasion, the female agents of SOE had become the single most valuable intelligence asset available to the Allies. They were gathering information on German troop dispositions, defensive positions, supply lines. They were organizing resistance networks to conduct sabotage on the day of invasion. They were, quite literally, preparing the ground for the liberation of Western Europe. And nobody knew they existed. The women's names never appeared in newspapers. They received no medals or public recognition. If they were captured and died in concentration camps, their sacrifice went unmourned and unrecorded. Even their families, in many cases, never knew what they had done. The secrecy was so absolute that years after the war, some of the women's contributions to the Allied victory remained classified. This lack of recognition was precisely what made the work possible. The Nazis couldn't defend against an enemy they didn't believe existed. June 5, 1944, Baker Street headquarters, London. The invasion of Normandy would begin the next morning. For months, Winston Churchill had been receiving detailed intelligence from SOE agents in occupied France. That intelligence had been crucial to planning the invasion. The Allies knew the location of German defensive positions because female agents had risked their lives gathering that information. They knew the state of German morale because women had infiltrated German officer clubs and reported what they overheard. They knew the status of German supply lines because women had counted trains and trucks. Now, as the invasion fleet prepared to sail, a new set of orders was being transmitted to SOE agents across occupied Europe. The orders were simple, terrible, and absolute. Begin sabotage operations immediately. Destroy railroad lines. Blow up ammunition dumps. Assassinate German officers. Do everything possible to prevent German reinforcements from reaching Normandy. It was, in essence, a death sentence for many of the agents. The Germans would respond to the sabotage with crushing force. Entire villages would be massacred in retaliation for resistance actions. The Germans would hunt down and execute anyone suspected of involvement in sabotage. The female agents understood this. They understood that they were being asked to conduct operations that would almost certainly result in their capture or death. And they understood that this was the moment for which they had trained, the moment for which they had sacrificed their lives and their identities. Nancy Wake received the orders in Lyon. She read the cipher and understood the implications immediately. The next 48 hours would be the most dangerous of her life. The sabotage operations began at midnight on June 5th. In the Rhone Valley, resistance fighters attacked German convoys. In the Loire Valley, railroad saboteurs destroyed railway lines that German reinforcements would need to use to reach Normandy. In Paris, assassination teams moved through the night, killing Gestapo officials and military commanders. The entire resistance network, for the first time, moved from a defensive posture to direct action. The German response was instant and catastrophic. The Wehrmacht, already stretched thin by the demands of the Eastern Front, found its ability to move reinforcements to Normandy severely compromised. French resistance saboteurs destroyed over 200 railway lines in the first week of the invasion. German truck convoys were ambushed and destroyed. German commanders found themselves unable to communicate with their subordinates because resistance fighters had destroyed telephone lines. It should be emphasized, none of this would have been possible without the intelligence gathering and network building that female SOE agents had been conducting for 2 years prior to the invasion. Nancy Wake had spent 2 years building a resistance network that, in a single week, forced the Germans to divert resources from Normandy to suppress resistance activity in southern France. The cost was enormous. Dozens of female agents were captured in the days and weeks following D-Day. Hundreds of resistance fighters died. Thousands of French civilians were executed in retaliatory operations. The Germans were fighting with a ferocity born of desperation. But the invasion succeeded. The Allies gained a foothold in Normandy. The liberation of Western Europe had begun. And the female spies had played a role just as crucial as the soldiers landing on the beaches, though their contribution would remain secret for decades. August 25, 1944, Paris. French forces liberated Paris. For the first time in 4 years, the swastika was taken down from public buildings. The occupation was ending. The tide had turned. But the women spies were still in danger. The Germans had not surrendered. They controlled the Eastern Front, where they continued to fight with undiminished ferocity. And the women who had infiltrated occupied France were still targets for German intelligence, still liable to capture, torture, and execution. More than half of the female agents who had been deployed to occupied France had been captured or killed. The casualty rate among women spies was actually higher than among male agents. The Germans, having initially underestimated women, had become particularly vicious once they realized what these women were capable of. Of the 42 female special agents deployed by SOE to occupied France, 15 were captured and executed. That's a casualty rate of roughly 35%. For context, that's higher than the casualty rate of soldiers on the front lines. Yet still, they came forward. More women volunteered for SOE service, knowing that they faced approximately a 1 in 3 chance of dying. They came forward because they understood something fundamental. Their sacrifice mattered. It was not abstract or meaningless. Every piece of intelligence they gathered, every sabotage operation they coordinated, every German soldier they killed or delayed, all of it contributed to the defeat of Nazi Germany. Odette Sansom, the woman who had been tortured by the Gestapo and survived Ravensbrück concentration camp, was liberated by Soviet forces in May 1945. She had lost a third of her body weight. She had been subjected to torture that broke bones and extracted fingernails. She had been forced to work as a slave laborer. She had contracted dysentery and nearly died of disease. But she survived. When she was liberated, she had a simple message. She had said nothing. She had not betrayed her networks. She had not revealed the names of other agents. She had maintained her silence through an ordeal designed to break the human spirit. She had won. Nancy Wake, the White Mouse, survived the war. After D-Day and the subsequent liberation of France, she was able to move more openly, eventually escaping to liberated French territory. She lived to tell her story, or at least the parts that could be told in the decades when so much remained classified. She was awarded the George Medal by the British Crown and made a Chevalier of the French Legion of Honor. But even these recognitions could not fully capture what she had accomplished. She had organized a resistance network that tied down German forces at a crucial moment. She had personally participated in sabotage operations. She had killed German soldiers. She had lived for years under the constant threat of torture and death. And she had emerged believing that her sacrifice had been worth it. May 7, 1945, Germany surrenders unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. The Third Reich had collapsed. German cities lay in ruins. The Nazi leadership was either dead or captured. The female spies came forward to be debriefed. Over weeks and months, intelligence officers recorded their experiences. Reports were filed. The women's contributions to the victory were documented, though often in heavily redacted form that would remain classified for decades. The official assessment from British intelligence was stark. Without the female agents of SOE, the invasion of Normandy would have faced significantly greater difficulties. German reinforcements would have reached Normandy faster. Resistance sabotage would have been less effective. The cost in Allied lives would have been substantially higher. The female agents of SOE had likely saved tens of thousands of lives. British, American, Canadian, and French lives. Yet when the war ended, there were no parades for the female spies. There were no medals presented before cheering crowds. The intelligence services that had deployed them went back to their pre-war practices of excluding women from field operations. The female agents were demobilized and sent back to civilian life with orders not to speak about what they had done. Secrecy had been necessary during the war, but it was maintained afterward for a different reason. The military establishment didn't want to acknowledge that women had played a crucial role in the victory. The dominant narrative was one of masculine military achievement. The female spies didn't fit that narrative. The invisible warriors remained invisible. Violette Sabo never came home. She died in Ravensbrück concentration camp in February 1945, just 3 months before the war ended. She was 23 years old. She had been a field agent for less than a year. She had been captured after only a few weeks of operational work. And yet she had managed to accomplish something extraordinary. She had provided intelligence that contributed to the success of the invasion. She had participated in sabotage operations that tied down German forces, and she had refused to break under torture. She was awarded the George Cross posthumously, the highest honor for civilian bravery. But the public never knew who she was or what she had done. Her family knew the barest outline. The full details of her service remained classified. Lise de Bissac, who had organized a network of over 100 resistance operatives in Lyon, survived the war, but she spent decades unable to speak about what she had done. The secrecy was so absolute that friends and family members had no idea of her real contributions to the war. She was simply the woman who had worked for military intelligence. That was all that could be said. It wasn't until the 1970s and 1980s, decades after the war ended, that historians and journalists began systematically uncovering the stories of the female SOE agents. Files were declassified. Women came forward to tell their stories, and a new understanding began to emerge. The female spies had been just as crucial to the victory as any general or admiral. March 1985, a reunion of SOE veterans in London. Nancy Wake, now 77 years old, sat in a room with other survivors of the organization. They were older now, their faces etched with decades, but something remained in their eyes, the knowledge that they had done something extraordinary. When asked about her experience, Nancy Wake spoke with a clarity that had nothing to do with age. People asked me if it was worth it, if it was worth the danger, the separation from my family, the years in hiding. And I always say the same thing. Yes, absolutely, without question. I watched my country conquered by Nazi barbarians. I watched them hunt down my friends and my family. I was given the opportunity to fight back, to actually do something meaningful to stop them. Of course, it was worth it. She paused, and her voice became quieter. But what troubles me is that people forgot about us. After the war, we were classified and hidden away. My friends who died, their sacrifice was forgotten. For decades, nobody knew what we had done. That, to me, is the true tragedy. Not that we suffered. We understood that suffering might be necessary, but that we were erased from history. The invisibility that had been a weapon during the war became a burden after it. The female spies had been trained to be invisible. They had been deployed in ways that made anonymity essential. But after the war, when the cause for secrecy had ended, that same invisibility persisted. It was only through the determination of historians, the courage of women who broke silence they had been ordered to maintain, and the evolution of public understanding about women's roles in warfare, that the story of the female SOE agents gradually emerged. By the 1990s and 2000s, books and documentaries began telling their stories. Archives were opened. The real extent of their contribution to the victory became clear. And slowly, gradually, society began to understand. Women had been just as important to defeating Nazi Germany as any soldier on the front lines. The female agents of SOE demonstrated something that military establishments had been refusing to acknowledge. Women were just as capable of undertaking dangerous, complex intelligence work as men. They could maintain cover identities. They could resist torture. They could make life or death decisions under pressure. They could kill. They could organize complex networks. They could think strategically. They could sacrifice everything for a cause they believed in. Yet for 40 years after the war, this truth was obscured by secrecy and bureaucratic indifference. The statistics tell part of the story. Of the 13 female agents executed by the Nazis, their deaths remained largely unknown until decades later. Of the thousands of male soldiers memorialized in war cemeteries and monuments, the female agents were barely mentioned. The Victoria Cross, awarded for bravery in the face of the enemy, was rarely given to women despite their courage under fire. But the deeper meaning of the female SOE agents' sacrifice transcends statistics. It represents a moment when ordinary women were called upon to do extraordinary things, and they answered that call. It represents the power of human courage in the face of systematic brutality. It represents the capacity of individuals to choose principle over survival. Christine Granville, who had been the first female SOE agent deployed to occupied Europe, was asked near the end of her life what motivated her to undertake such dangerous work. "I saw something that needed to be done," she said simply. "I was capable of doing it. I did it. That's all there is to it. No grand philosophy, no elaborate ideology. I saw evil and I chose to fight it. Anyone would do the same, given the opportunity. But not everyone would do the same. Not everyone has the fortitude to volunteer for work that almost certainly means capture, torture, and death. Not everyone can make the psychological transformation necessary to become a spy, to live a lie so completely that the lie becomes your reality. Not everyone can resist torture without breaking. Not everyone can accept that their sacrifice will go unrecognized. The female spies could and did. When historians calculate the impact of SOE operations on the Allied victory, they use different metrics. They measure railroad lines destroyed, bridges sabotaged, German soldiers killed. They calculate how many days of delay German reinforcements experienced. They estimate how many lives these delays saved by reducing German defensive strength at crucial moments. The calculations are staggering. The sabotage operations coordinated by female agents destroyed an estimated 400 kilometers of railroad track in the month following D-Day alone. The destruction of these lines meant German reinforcements traveled not by rail, where they could move quickly and concentrate forces, but by road, where they were vulnerable to air attack and ambush. This delay, measured in days but representing the movement of thousands of troops, potentially affected the outcome of the Normandy campaign. Military historians estimate that for every day that German reinforcements were delayed in reaching Normandy, between 100 and 500 Allied soldiers' lives were saved. Using conservative estimates, the delays caused by SOE sabotage potentially saved tens of thousands of lives. All of this, the railroad destruction, the German casualties, the saved lives, trace back to the work of female agents like Nancy Wake, Lise de Bissac, and hundreds of others who had spent years building resistance networks before the invasion. Yet, when the war ended, this contribution was forgotten. The female agents were not included in the major historical accounts of the invasion. They appeared, if at all, as footnotes. The dominant narrative focused on generals and soldiers, on ships and planes, on the grand strategy of military operations. The invisible warriors remained invisible. While the strategic impact of the female SOE agents can be measured in military terms, the personal cost cannot be easily quantified. Consider the case of Pearl Witherington, a British agent who became one of the most successful saboteurs in occupied France. She organized a network of over 3,000 resistance fighters. She personally participated in dozens of sabotage operations. She killed German soldiers. She coordinated attacks on German installations. And she lived the entire war as a fraud. She assumed the identity of a French widow named Jacqueline Dubois. For 3 years, she lived this identity so completely that even her own family back in Britain might not have recognized her. She spoke French with complete fluency, adapted her mannerisms and dress to fit the French context, developed an elaborate personal history that she had to recall without hesitation. She could never afford to drop the mask. Not for a moment. If a neighbor became suspicious, if a Gestapo agent questioned her identity, if she made a mistake and revealed a detail about her false background that didn't align with her legend, any of these could mean capture and execution. The psychological toll of maintaining a false identity for 3 years is difficult for ordinary people to comprehend. You don't get to be yourself. You don't get to have private moments where you drop the facade. You are always performing, always lying, always terrified of being discovered. When the war ended and Pearl Witherington was able to return to Britain, she had to undergo a kind of psychological reconstruction. She had to relearn how to be herself. She had to integrate her experiences as a saboteur and a soldier with her identity as a woman in post-war British society. Many of the female agents struggled with this reintegration. They had lived intense, consequential lives during the war, making life or death decisions, commanding respect, accomplishing things that mattered. Then the war ended, and society expected them to return to conventional female roles. Get married, raise children, be domestic, return to invisibility. For many of the female spies, that transition was psychologically devastating. Violette Szabo's daughter, who was only 4 years old when Violette was captured, grew up knowing virtually nothing about her mother except that she had worked for the government. The full details of Violette's service remained classified until the 1980s. Violette's daughter spent decades not knowing that her mother had been a decorated soldier, a saboteur, a hero in the truest sense. She only knew that her mother had disappeared. When the truth eventually emerged, the daughter had to confront not only her grief at her mother's death, but also her anger at having been denied the knowledge of what her mother had accomplished. The sacrifice that Violette had made was not only physical. It included the sacrifice of being recognized, of having her story told, of having her daughter know the truth about who she was. Military psychologists have long studied the question of what makes people capable of extraordinary courage. They have examined soldiers who charge into machine gun fire. They have studied pilots who fly suicide missions. They have analyzed resistance fighters who undergo torture without breaking. The female SOE agents present an interesting case study because their courage operated in a different register than conventional military courage. They didn't have the structure of military hierarchy to give meaning to their sacrifice. They didn't have the camaraderie of soldiers fighting alongside them. They didn't have uniforms or official status that might grant them prisoner of war protections if captured. They had only their training and their conviction. SOE training specifically attempted to create a psychological framework that would enable agents to withstand capture and torture. The training emphasized several key principles. First, the idea that the mission was more important than the individual. The agent was taught to think of themselves as replaceable. If they were captured and killed, other agents would continue the work. The mission would go on. This removed some of the ego-driven fear of death, the fear that if you died, something irreplaceable would be lost. Second, the belief that resistance was possible even in the worst circumstances. The training taught agents to look for small ways to resist, maintaining their cover story, not volunteering information, protecting their networks through strategic lies. This gave agents something to do even when they were helpless before torture. They couldn't stop the physical pain, but they could control their responses to it. They could choose what they said. Third, the development of a psychological compartmentalization that allowed agents to separate their physical body from their conscious mind. During torture, the body experienced pain, but the mind could retreat into memories, thoughts, fantasies, anything that maintained continuity of self. These techniques, which would later be codified and systematized in various intelligence agencies' training programs, essentially taught agents to endure the unendurable. But beyond the technical training, what made the female SOE agents capable of extraordinary courage was something more fundamental. They understood what they were fighting against. They had seen the Nazis in action. Many of them, like Nancy Wake, had personal experience with Gestapo brutality. They knew that the Nazi regime wasn't simply a military adversary, it was a moral catastrophe. It was the systematic destruction of human dignity, the mechanization of murder, the industrialization of evil. Set against that knowledge, personal survival seemed almost trivial. One of the most important but underappreciated aspects of the female SOE agents' work was their role in the evolution of intelligence technology. During the early years of the war, radio communication was primitive. Radio sets were large, power-hungry, and required long transmission times. A radio operator broadcasting from occupied France might need to transmit for 5 minutes or more to send a message. During that 5-minute window, German direction-finding equipment could potentially locate the transmitter. The female radio operators, women like Noor Inayat Khan, Maureen O'Sullivan, and Jacqueline Nern, had to become experts in minimizing transmission times. They developed techniques for compressing messages, for using abbreviations, for avoiding unnecessary chatter. More importantly, they became adept at moving their radio sets frequently. Every day, the location changed. The radio operator would set up in a different apartment, transmit, and immediately pack up and move to another location. The Germans were constantly trying to triangulate their position using direction-finding equipment, but by the time they narrowed down the location, the operator was already gone. The female radio operators were working at the cutting edge of counterintelligence technology. They were engaged in an invisible arms race against German signal intelligence, each side developing new techniques, each side attempting to stay ahead of the other. Noor Inayat Khan, the daughter of an Indian Sufi musician and an American woman, was a particularly skilled radio operator. She was 29 years old, multilingual, classically trained in music. She had come to Britain as a refugee from Nazi-occupied France. She volunteered for SOE service. Noor was assigned to Paris, where she was supposed to maintain radio contact with London while coordinating resistance operations in the French capital. She arrived in occupied Paris in late 1943, carrying a radio set hidden in her luggage. The Gestapo in Paris was particularly active. They had devoted enormous resources to finding and stopping clandestine radio operators. They had teams of direction-finding experts working around the clock to locate illicit broadcasts, nor managed to evade them for months. She transmitted regularly, providing London with intelligence about German military movements in the Paris area. She helped coordinate resistance operations. She maintained her cover identity as a French woman in occupied Paris. But in the spring of 1944, the Gestapo closed in. Other members of her network were arrested, and under interrogation, some of them revealed details about her location. On September 13, 1944, Noor was arrested by the Gestapo. She was taken to Gestapo headquarters in Paris, where she was interrogated for weeks. The Germans understood that she was a radio operator, the most valuable asset in an intelligence network. They offered her a choice: cooperate and live or resist and die. Noor chose resistance. She was tortured. She was starved. She was subjected to the full arsenal of Gestapo interrogation techniques. But she refused to cooperate with her captors. She did not reveal the location of other networks. She did not provide the frequencies and codes that would allow the Germans to intercept Allied communications. Eventually, the Gestapo concluded that she would never break. They classified her as too dangerous to keep alive. She was transferred to a concentration camp. In September 1944, just as the Allies were beginning to liberate France, Noor Inayat Khan was executed. She was 29 years old. She had been a radio operator for less than a year, but in that time, she had transmitted hundreds of messages that contributed to the success of the liberation of Paris. When we speak of the female SOE agents, we often focus on individual stories. Nancy Wake's escape from the Gestapo, Odette Sansom's survival of Ravensbrück, Violette Szabo's refusal to break under torture. These individual stories are important and powerful. But there is another story that deserves to be told: the story of the collective sacrifice. Between 1941 and 1945, approximately 13,000 British personnel worked for or with SOE. Of these, the female operatives numbered around 450. Among the female operatives, approximately 50 were deployed as field agents to occupied territory. Of these 50, approximately 15 were captured and executed by the Nazis. 30% casualty rate. That is higher than the casualty rate of any combat unit on the European front. Yet these women volunteered for this work knowing the odds. They knew that capture was likely. They knew that torture was probable. They knew that death was possible, and they went anyway because they understood that the work was essential. The female SOE agents represented a kind of collective courage. It wasn't simply that individual women were brave. It was that an entire cohort of women chose to undergo training that would prepare them for capture and torture. They chose to volunteer for missions where death was a likely outcome. They chose to sacrifice their anonymity, their safety, their identities, for the possibility of contributing to the defeat of Nazi Germany. This collective sacrifice demands to be remembered and honored. In military cemeteries across Europe, you can find graves of soldiers who died in the liberation of occupied territories. These soldiers are honored with military ceremonies, memorial services, official recognition. But the female spies who died making that liberation possible are often buried in unmarked graves, or their bodies were never found, or they were cremated in concentration camp incinerators and their ashes scattered. Yet they died for the same cause. They died for the same liberation. There are aspects of the female SOE agent's story that may never be fully known. The secrecy that protected them during the war continued to protect their actions afterward. Many files remain classified even today. Some of the female agents took their secrets to their graves, maintaining their cover stories so completely that even in death, their real identities and activities were not publicly disclosed. This raises important questions about how we understand history. If crucial historical events remain hidden for decades, if the people responsible for those events are denied recognition, has the true history of the war been recorded? The answer for the female SOE agents is clearly no. The true history of their contribution to the Allied victory has only partially emerged, and even now, 75 years after the war ended, significant details remain unknown or classified. One of the most interesting questions that historians continue to grapple with is, how many of the female agents' accomplishments will never be known? If an agent was captured and held in secret, then executed after providing intelligence under torture, how would that intelligence contribution ever be documented? If a female agent conducted sabotage operations but was never captured and never made an official report about those operations, would anyone ever know about it? The answer is that a significant portion of the female SOE agents' contributions to the war effort may be forever unknown. This is particularly true for agents who survived the war but remained so deeply embedded in their cover identities that they could not safely reveal what they had done. Some female agents, when debriefed after the war, refused to provide comprehensive accounts of their activities, fearing that disclosure would endanger people still living in occupied territories. The female SOE agent's story is also a story about the evolution of how society understands courage, sacrifice, and the role of women in warfare. In 1945, when the war ended, the dominant culture was still shaped by assumptions that had been developing for centuries. That warfare was a male domain, that military service was the province of men, that courage in combat was fundamentally a masculine virtue. The female SOE agents didn't fit this paradigm. They had demonstrated courage that was the equal of any soldier. They had participated in military operations. They had killed. They had accepted the possibility of death. Yet they were not soldiers, at least not in any official sense. They were spies. They operated outside the military structure. They had no uniforms, no ranks, no official status. This ambiguity made it difficult for post-war society to integrate the female agents into the dominant narrative of the war. They couldn't be celebrated as soldiers because they weren't officially part of the military. They couldn't be celebrated as civilians because their work was military in nature. They fell into a kind of categorical void where they were neither properly military nor properly civilian. This ambiguity is part of what led to their invisibility in post-war memory. Over the decades, as feminist scholarship developed and began to challenge traditional assumptions about gender and warfare, the female SOE agents gradually began to receive more attention and recognition. Historians like Sarah Helm and Noreen Rials began documenting their stories. The female agents themselves, as they aged and began to feel that their stories would be lost if they didn't speak, started publishing memoirs and giving interviews. By the 1990s and 2000s, a more complete picture of the female SOE agents' contribution began to emerge. They were recognized not as curiosities or anomalies, but as skilled operatives who had played a crucial role in the Allied victory. This recognition did not come automatically. It came through the sustained effort of historians, journalists, and the female agents themselves, many of them elderly by that point, choosing to break decades of silence to ensure that their stories would not be forgotten. Nancy Wake lived until 2001, dying at the age of 98. In her later years, she gave interviews about her experiences, wrote books, and became something of an elder stateswoman of the resistance movement. She had survived not only the war but the decades of anonymity that followed it. She had the satisfaction of eventually seeing her contributions recognized and honored. But she was not the only legacy of the female SOE agents. The female agents' success in World War II fundamentally changed the way intelligence agencies thought about recruiting and deploying female operatives. After the war, despite initial attempts to return to male-dominated intelligence services, the demonstrated effectiveness of female agents became increasingly difficult to ignore. Intelligence services around the world began, gradually and often reluctantly, to recruit women as field agents. The female SOE agents had established a precedent. They had proven that women could do this work. They could maintain cover identities. They could resist torture. They could make complex decisions under pressure. By the Cold War, female intelligence operatives were becoming more common, though still operating within male-dominated bureaucratic structures. By the late 20th century, women had become integral to intelligence operations for virtually every major intelligence service in the world. The female SOE agents had, in effect, opened a door that could never be fully closed again. The military and intelligence establishments had been forced to confront the reality of female capability in these domains. The women who came after them benefited from this precedent. In 2002, a memorial to the female SOE agents was established in London. It lists the names of the 13 female agents executed by the Nazis, commemorates their sacrifice. It ensures that their names and their memory will not be forgotten. The memorial is modest in size, befitting the quiet nature of espionage work. But it stands as testimony to something crucial: the recognition that these women were heroes in the truest sense. Heroes are not always the ones in the dramatic action sequences. Sometimes they are the ones working in the shadows, maintaining cover identities, gathering intelligence, sacrificing anonymity and safety for causes they believed in. The female SOE agents embodied this kind of heroism. When all the accounts are totaled, when all the operations are analyzed, when all the contributions are measured, the female spies of SOE emerge as one of the most significant forces in the Allied victory over Nazi Germany. They were not recognized at the time. They were not celebrated in the immediate post-war period. Their contributions were often minimized or forgotten. But the historical record, when examined carefully, shows the truth. Without these women, the war would have been longer, costlier, and more difficult to win. They paid the price for this truth. Some paid with their lives. All of them paid with years of secrecy, anonymity, and the denial of recognition for their sacrifices. But the truth remains. The female spies who risked everything did not risk in vain. They contributed materially to the defeat of Nazi Germany. They proved that courage is not determined by gender. They demonstrated that women are just as capable as men of undertaking dangerous, complex, consequential work. And they changed history, even if history was slow to acknowledge it. In a 1985 reunion of surviving SOE operatives, an aging Christine Granville, the Polish adventurer who had been one of the first female agents, was asked what message she would want to leave for future generations. She thought for a long moment before responding. I would say this. There are moments in history when ordinary people are called upon to do extraordinary things. When those moments come, and when you are capable of responding to that call, you have a choice. You can step forward or you can step back. Most people step back. They rationalize it. They say it's not their responsibility. They say others will handle it. And usually they're right. Someone else will handle it. But when the history is written, it is not the people who stepped back who are remembered. It is the people who stepped forward. We stepped forward. Cost us. Some of my friends did not come home. The rest of us carried scars, visible and invisible, for the rest of our lives. But we never regretted it. We never questioned whether it was worth the price, because we had seen what the alternative was. We had seen what happened when people stepped back and let evil proceed unopposed. We knew that price would be far higher, so we stepped forward. And whatever recognition or lack thereof came after, we knew that we had done what needed to be done. That is enough. The female spies of SOE remain among the most forgotten heroes of World War II. They operated in shadows, maintained impossible secrecy, underwent torture without breaking, and contributed materially to the Allied victory. Yet for decades, their story was untold. Their sacrifice was unrecognized. Their courage was unacknowledged. Only in recent years have their full contributions begun to emerge from the classified files and historical records. And still, the story remains incomplete. Still, there are details that will never be known, secrets that died with the agents, achievements that were too sensitive to ever be publicly disclosed. But the essential truth remains. A small group of women volunteered to do the most dangerous work imaginable. They accepted that they would likely be captured, tortured, and executed. They accepted that they would be invisible, that their work would never be recognized. They accepted anonymity and danger and the possibility of death. And they did it anyway, because they understood that some things are worth dying for, that some causes transcend personal survival, that courage is not about being unafraid, it is about being terrified and proceeding anyway. The female spies of SOE were heroes. History has finally begun to acknowledge that truth. It is a recognition that came far too late, but it is a recognition that was long overdue. They risked everything, and they deserve to be remembered.